The cold had teeth. Nora felt them bite into her fingers first, then her cheeks, then the thin skin stretched across her knuckles as she gripped the edge of her gray wool cloak and pulled it tighter around her shoulders. The fabric was damp from the night fog that rolled off the river beyond the village walls, and no matter how hard she pressed the hood against her ears, the wind still found a way in, threading itself beneath the wool, curling around her neck like something deliberate, something cruel. The market square of Veldrath was quieter than it should have been for a harvest evening. The torches along the stone archways threw orange light across the cobblestones in uneven stripes, and merchants who would normally still be hawking their last cuts of salted meat and dried herbs had begun pulling their canvas coverings down early, their eyes moving toward the far end of the square, with the kind of careful, practiced indifference that people in this kingdom had learned to wear like a second skin. Nora understood that indifference. She had worn it herself for 3 years. She kept her head down, her long blonde braid falling over one shoulder and brushing the worn leather strap of the satchel she carried against her hip. Inside it, a bundle of dried valerian root, 2 small glass vials of lavender oil sealed with wax, and a folded square of linen she used to wrap herbs for her mistress, Lady Edra, of the merchant quarter. Simple things, unimportant things, exactly the kind of things an Omega woman ought to carry through a market square without drawing a single eye. She had almost made it to the far archway when she heard the boots, not the shuffling, uneven steps of villagers or the soft leather soles of traders. These were heavy, iron-studded, deliberate, striking the cobblestones in perfect unison. 4 sets of them. She counted without looking up, the way she always counted, the way she had learned to count danger before she let herself see it. Keep walking, she told herself. You are no one. You carry nothing of value. Keep walking. But the boots stopped, and then a voice, rough as river gravel, carrying the particular arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been told no, called out across the square. That one. Nora's stomach dropped. She did not run. Running was the worst thing an Omega could do in the presence of a Beta enforcer, because running said I have something to hide, and she had learned that lesson at the cost of a bruised wrist and 2 nights in a holding pen 3 winters ago. So instead, she stopped, drew a slow breath that tasted of wood smoke and damp stone, and turned. There were 4 of them. She had been right about the count. They wore the dark green cloaks of Lord Casvan's personal enforcers, the silver wolf head pin at each throat catching the torchlight. Casvan was the regional governor, a Beta who had purchased his title and his authority, and who had spent the better part of a decade reminding every Omega in the Veldrath district exactly how much of that authority he was willing to use. The one who had spoken was tall, with a jaw like a quarried stone, and eyes that moved over Nora the way a merchant assessed livestock at auction. He held a rolled parchment in one hand, and when he reached her, he unrolled it without ceremony and held it up beside her face, comparing something on it to the woman standing before him. Nora of the lower quarter, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she answered. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. You owe 2 months of Omega taxation to Lord Casvan's ledger. He rolled the parchment again with a single practiced snap. With the late penalty added, that comes to 14 silver coins. 14 silver. It might as well have been 14 stones of gold. An Omega healer's assistant earned 3 copper coins a week if her mistress was generous, and Lady Edra, for all her better qualities, was not generous. I was granted an extension, Nora said carefully, by the tax recorder himself. I have a written agreement. The extension expired at the last new moon. The enforcer stepped closer, and Nora held her ground by sheer force of will, even as every instinct in her Omega blood screamed at the proximity of a dominant Beta in authority. You have 2 choices, pay now or come with us. Come with us meant the debtor pens beneath Casvan's estate. She had seen women come out of those pens. She had seen what they looked like afterward. The kind of stillness that settled into a person when something essential had been broken. I don't have 14 silver, she said. Not tonight. The enforcer reached out and closed his hand around her arm, just above the elbow, with the casual certainty of a man who expected no resistance. The other three spread out slightly behind him, a wall of green wool and iron boots, and the last of the market vendors who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found urgent reasons to look elsewhere entirely. Nora's heart was slamming against her ribs. Her mouth had gone dry. She was calculating the distance to the archway, the weight of the satchel as a possible distraction, whether she could twist free of his grip without triggering the kind of response that ended with someone bleeding on the cobblestones. When a shadow fell across all of them, not the shadow of a torch being blocked, or a cloud moving across the half-moon above the square. A person's shadow, long, still, cast from the direction of the northern archway, where the road from the King's Road entered Veldrath. The enforcer's hand tightened on Nora's arm for 1/2 second, and then, very slowly, it released. She felt the change before she understood it. A shift in the air, the way the atmosphere in a room shifts when a fire is suddenly fed more wood. The temperature didn't drop, it compressed. Every wolf instinct in her body recognized it at the same moment the enforcer took a step backward. This was alpha presence, not the borrowed authority of a purchased title. Something older, something that lived in the blood. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the torchlight, which meant she saw the details of him in pieces, the way you see a storm gathering over distant hills. One element at a time, each one adding to the whole until the whole became something too large to ignore. The long black braids falling over shoulders sheathed in a manto of dark fur. The leather armor crossing his chest in thick straps, worn and battle-scarred in a way that spoke of actual use rather than ceremony. The forearm bracers of dark leather, the iron buckles catching the light. The jaw, sharp-edged beneath a short dark beard, and above it, ice-blue eyes that moved across the scene in front of him, with the particular quality of absolute stillness. He was not still because he was calm. He was still the way a wolf is still before it moves. Behind him, at a respectful distance, stood two figures in dark armor bearing no insignia Nora recognized. Not Casvin's green, not any lord's color. Just black. The kind of black that didn't announce itself. The enforcer's voice, when it came, had lost several layers of its earlier confidence. "My lord, this is a taxation matter. A district concern. There is no need. Let her go." 3 words, quiet, absolute. The enforcer released Nora's arm so fast she nearly stumbled. She caught herself, pressing her hand against the satchel at her hip, her pulse still hammering but her feet steady on the cold cobblestones. The man with the braids walked toward her. Not toward the enforcers, toward her. He moved through the torchlight, and she saw the scar now, a thin, pale line along his left cheekbone, almost invisible beneath the dark stubble. His eyes didn't leave her face, and there was something in them that unsettled her far more than the enforcer's grip had. Not threat, not appraisal, but a kind of sharp focus that made her feel as though he had already made several decisions about this situation, and she was only now catching up. He stopped beside her, so close she could smell pine resin and cold iron, and something beneath both of those. Something that her wolf blood recognized before her mind did, something that made the back of her throat tighten inexplicably. He did not look at the enforcers when he spoke again. He looked only at her, and he leaned down, just slightly, just enough that his voice reached her ear, and no further, and said quietly, with an absolute calm that somehow made the words more alarming rather than less. "You are in danger. Pretend I am your husband." Nora stared up at him. And then, before she could draw a single breath to respond, he straightened and turned to face the enforcers with an expression that could have been carved from the same stone as the castle walls, and said clearly, for everyone in the square to hear, "My wife owes nothing to Casvin's ledger, and if his men lay hands on her again, I will personally deliver that message to the Lord himself." A pause. What remains of him? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Nora had ever heard. Nobody moved. The 4 enforcers stood in the uneven torchlight like men who had suddenly forgotten how their legs worked, their green cloaks catching the night wind, their eyes moving between the man beside Nora and the 2 silent figures in black armor positioned behind him. The iron-jawed enforcer who had spoken, who had grabbed her arm with such casual certainty not 2 minutes ago, was doing something Nora had never seen one of Casvan's men do before. He was calculating whether he could afford to push back. The answer, written plainly across his face in the language of instinct that all wolves understood regardless of rank, was no. "My lord," he said finally, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man choosing surrender while trying to make it look like something else. "We were unaware the woman had a bond claim. Now you are aware." The man beside Nora did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Take your men and go." A beat, then another. Then the enforcer rolled the parchment once more, tucked it beneath his arm, and turned. The other 3 fell into step behind him without a word. Their iron-studded boots rang against the cobblestones, still deliberate, still heavy, but faster now, moving toward the far end of the square, with the controlled urgency of men who had decided that the fastest road away from a situation was the wisest one. Nora watched them go. She counted to 10. Old habit. She always counted to 10 before she trusted that a threat had actually passed, because in her experience, threats had a way of turning around. They didn't turn around. The square was quiet. The remaining torches hissed softly in the damp air. Somewhere beyond the stone archway, a horse shifted its weight and blew out a slow breath, and the sound was so ordinary that it almost made her laugh. A thin, slightly hysterical sound that she pressed back down before it could reach her throat. She turned to look at the man beside her. Up close, in the fuller light of the nearest torch, he was even more difficult to look at than he had been from a distance. Not because he was frightening, though he was, in the way that all things with genuine power are frightening, but because he was focused. Those ice-blue eyes were already moving across the square in a slow, systematic sweep, cataloging exits and shadows and the positions of the few remaining people who had not yet found reason to leave. "They'll report to Casvan before morning," he said. Not to her, precisely. More the way a person thinks aloud when they're working through a map in their head. "They will," Nora agreed, because it was true, and because she needed to say something before the silence between them became the kind that grew roots. "Lord Casvan will know by dawn that one of his taxation matters was interrupted." She paused, carefully choosing her next word, "by a stranger." He looked at her then, directly. The sweep of the square paused, and all of that focus landed on her face with a weight she felt across her shoulders. "Does that concern you?" he asked. "It concerns me significantly," she said, "because tomorrow morning I still live in this district. And you—" She stopped. "And I?" he prompted. There was something in his tone, not mockery, not impatience, closer to genuine curiosity, which somehow surprised her more than either of those would have. "You will presumably be somewhere else," she finished. He was quiet for a moment. One of the silent figures in black armor had moved closer. A woman, Nora realized now, tall and broad-shouldered with a dark braid of her own, and the careful, watchful expression of someone whose occupation was exactly what it appeared to be. The woman's eyes moved to her commander, if that was what he was, with a brief, questioning quality that he answered with the smallest tilt of his head. The woman stepped back. "Walk with me," he said to Nora. It was not precisely an order, but it was not a request either. It existed in the particular space between the two that alphas seemed to occupy naturally, the tone that assumed cooperation without demanding it, which Nora had always found more difficult to resist than outright commands, because outright commands she could argue with. She walked with him. They moved away from the center of the square toward the narrow lane that ran along the western wall of the market, where the torches were fewer, and the shadows between the old stone buildings were long and dark. The 2 armored figures followed at a distance that was close enough to be protective and far enough to be discreet. "You know who I am?" he said, when they were out of the main square's earshot. Nora considered lying. She was good at it when she needed to be. 3 years of navigating Casvan's district had made her good at a great many things she wished she didn't need. But something about the directness of the question made the lie feel both obvious and unnecessary. "I have a reasonable suspicion," she said instead, And yet you didn't react when you saw me. I reacted, she said. I simply didn't do it where anyone could see. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, too controlled for that. But the sharp line of his mouth eased slightly at one corner, and the quality of his attention changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, and yet somehow entirely clear. Nora, he said. Her name in his mouth stopped her walking for half a step. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. You know my name, she said. The enforcer used it in the square. A beat. I pay attention. Of course he did. She adjusted her grip on her satchel strap and kept walking. Then you have the advantage. My lord, you know my name, and I only have a suspicion about yours. Dominic, he said. He said it the way he said everything, simply without decoration. And yet the name landed with the specific weight of something that carried far more meaning than its single syllable suggested. Because Nora's suspicion, it turned out, had been correct. Dominic, the Alpha King of Veldrath, of the Northern Reaches, of the 6 territories that spread across the better part of the known lands, like the shadow of a great wing. She stopped walking. He stopped too, a half step ahead of her, and turned, and waited, and she had the distinct impression he was doing her the courtesy of giving her a moment to absorb it before he said anything else. Why, she said when she found her voice, is the Alpha King walking through Veldrath's market square at night, without a visible guard? She glanced at the 2 armored figures. Visibly. I travel without ceremony when I want to see things as they actually are, he said, rather than as they are arranged for me to see them. There was something underneath those words, something with edges. She filed it away. And what did you see tonight? She asked. In things as they actually are. Lord Casvan's men applying Omega taxation with considerable enthusiasm. His voice remained even, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The same kind of compression she had felt in the air when he had first appeared, as though some internal temperature had risen by several degrees without showing on the surface. Among other things. Nora looked at him for a long moment. The fog from the river had thickened while they walked, and it drifted now through the narrow lane in pale wisps, catching on the edges of stone doorways and pooling along the base of the old walls. The cold had not lessened. She could feel it through the soles of her boots, rising from the cobblestones. You cannot solve my situation with 2 words and a meaningful stare, my lord, she said. Casvan will take it out on the district when you leave. He always does when he feels his authority has been questioned. I am aware of what Casvan does. Then you'll understand why your intervention tonight, however. She searched for the right word. Dramatic. May have made things worse for the people who actually live here. The silence that followed was not empty. It had the particular texture of a silence in which someone was reconsidering something. You're not afraid of me, he said finally. It didn't sound like a complaint. I didn't say that, Nora replied honestly. I said Casvan is a sustained problem and you are a single evening. He looked at her, really looked, in a way that felt less like appraisal and more like recognition. The way you look at something familiar that you haven't seen in a long time and can't immediately place. Come to the inn at the northern gate, he said. The one with the red door. Tonight. I have a proposal for you, and before you refuse, I want you to know that it concerns Casvan directly. Nora's jaw tightened. A proposal. A practical one. The last time someone made me a practical proposal involving Lord Casvan, she said, I ended up in a holding pen for 2 nights. This one, he said, will not end in a holding pen. A pause. I give you my word. She should have said no. Every sensible instinct she possessed, every carefully maintained habit of survival built across 3 years in this district, said no. Do not go to the inn with the red door. Do not follow a man you met 40 minutes ago into a private room, regardless of who he claims to be. Do not let yourself be moved by the steadiness in his voice, or the way he said your name as though it mattered. She looked at him one more time. 1 hour, she said. I'll give you 1 hour. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the square, the two armored figures falling silently into step behind him, and Nora stood in the cold fog of the narrow lane with her satchel against her hip, and her heart still not entirely steady, watching the torchlight consume his shadow as he walked away. She pressed her cold fingers together, drew a breath that tasted of river mist and wood smoke, and made a decision she suspected would change everything. She went to find the inn with the red door. The inn with the red door was called the Grey Stag, and it sat at the end of the northern lane like a man who had seen better days, but refused to acknowledge it. The timber frame warped slightly at the upper corners. The painted stag above the entrance faded to a ghost of its former red, but the interior warm enough, and the fire large enough, that the common room carried the particular smell of pine smoke and roasted barley that meant people had been coming here for a long time and intended to keep doing so. Nora pushed through the door and felt the warmth hit her face like a held breath finally released. The common room was half full. Merchants, a few traveling craftsmen, 2 women in the rough linen of village traders sharing a pot of something over a corner table. Nobody looked up when she entered, which was exactly the kind of anonymity she preferred. She kept her hood up, her braid tucked forward over one shoulder, and scanned the room the way she always scanned rooms, systematically, starting from the exits. She found him at a table near the back, close enough to the fire to be warm, but positioned with his back against the stone wall and a clear sightline to the door. Of course, the 2 armored figures were not visible, which meant they were somewhere nearby and she simply couldn't see them, which was somehow more unsettling than if they had been standing directly behind him. He had a clay cup in front of him and a second one across the table, still empty. He saw her the moment she entered. She was certain of it, though his expression didn't change, and he did not gesture or call to her, simply waited with that particular quality of stillness she was already beginning to recognize as simply the way he occupied space. She crossed the room and sat down across from him. The fire threw warm light across the table between them, turning the worn oak surface amber. Up close, without the drama of the square and the enforcers and the cold fog to compress everything into urgency, she could look at him more carefully. The scar along his left cheekbone was older than she had first thought, fully healed, the pale line of it clean and thin. The braids in his dark hair were tightly woven, several of them threaded with small iron rings near the ends that caught the firelight. His hands, resting on the table, were scarred across the knuckles in the way that spoke of years of fighting, rather than training alone. He was younger than she had expected a king to be. That was the first truly surprising thing. Not young. There was nothing young about his eyes. But perhaps 2 or 3 years past 30, which meant he had become what he was when he was still very much in the process of becoming something. She wondered what that had cost him. "You came," he said. "I said I would." She settled her satchel against the chair leg and folded her hands on the table. "You said you had a proposal." He reached across and filled the second cup from a small earthen pitcher, warm cider from the smell of it, spiced with clove and something sharper underneath. He pushed it toward her. She didn't touch it yet. "Lord Casvan has been submitting falsified ledgers to the Crown for 4 years, Dominic said, without preamble. Taxation records, trade assessments, population counts, all adjusted. The actual collection rates in this district are nearly twice what is reported to my treasury. The excess goes directly into Casvan's personal accounts and the pockets of the regional council members who support him." Nora looked at him. "I know," she said. A brief pause. "You know. Everyone in the lower quarter knows. We are the ones being taxed twice." She wrapped her hands around the clay cup, not to drink, just for the warmth of it seeping into her cold fingers. "The question the people of this district have been asking for 4 years is why the Crown doesn't know." Something moved behind his eyes, not offense. Closer to the particular expression of a man hearing a difficult thing, said plainly when he is accustomed to people softening difficult things for him. "Because Casvan is careful," Dominic said. And because the people closest to me who should have been monitoring this district were either complicit or insufficiently motivated to look past the surface numbers. A pause. That changes now. Why now? Because I walked through this market tonight and watched one of his enforcers put his hand on a woman over a taxation debt she doesn't legitimately owe, he said. And there was something in his voice on those last words. Not heat, but a compression. The way a blade compresses the air before it moves. And the moment I saw it, I understood that what I had suspected for months and what is actually happening in this district are not the same thing. Nora was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Someone in the common room laughed at something, a genuine sound, startling in the context of what they were discussing. You said a proposal, she said. I need someone who lives in this district, Dominic said. Someone who knows Kasvan's methods from the inside, the patterns of his collection, the names of his intermediaries, the locations where the excess taxation is held before it's moved. I need that information to build a case that cannot be dismissed or absorbed by the regional council. He paused. You are a healer's assistant. You move through every quarter of this district. People talk to you. People talk to healers, she said carefully, because healers are not connected to power. The moment I am seen as connected to the crown, they stop talking. Which is why no one can know you're connected to me. She looked at him steadily. And how exactly do you propose to maintain that separation? Your enforcers already name me a bond claim in front of Kasvan's men. By morning, every ear in this district will have heard that story, and changed it into something larger. Dominic leaned forward slightly. The firelight moved across his face, catching the ice blue of his eyes and the sharp line of his jaw. That is precisely the situation I want to use, he said. Kasvan will investigate the claim. He will want to know who made it, and whether it has any substance. Because if an Omega woman in his district has a genuine bond claim from a lord powerful enough to make his enforcers stand down, he needs to know about it. Nora felt the shape of where this was going before he said it, and felt something cold settle at the base of her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. You want to maintain the pretense? She said. Temporarily. Long enough for Kasvan to become uncertain. Uncertain men make mistakes, and mistakes leave evidence. Long enough for me to conduct a proper investigation without alerting him that one is underway. He paused. Long enough to protect you. I don't need... You owe 14 silver coins you don't have, he said, not unkindly. And the man who holds your debt has 4 enforcers willing to use their hands to make a point. You need something. His voice was level. This is what I can offer. Nora looked down at the cup in her hands. The spiced cider had cooled slightly and the clove smell had deepened, and she thought about Lady Edra's worried face that morning, when the tax notice had arrived, and the holding pens beneath Kasvan's estate, and the women she had seen come out of them. What exactly would this pretense require? She asked. You would be seen with me publicly on 2 or 3 occasions over the next fortnight, he said. Nothing elaborate. A presence. Enough to give Kasvan's informants something to report. A pause. My second, Captain Sarah, will remain in the district. If you are threatened or approached, she is 2 streets away at all times. And after? When the investigation is complete? You will have your debt cleared, your name removed from Kasvan's collection lists, and a letter of crown protection that no regional lord in the 6 territories can override. He held her gaze steadily. And Kasvan will answer to the crown for what he has done to this district. The fire settled with a low sound, sending a brief shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Nora pressed her thumb against the rim of the clay cup and thought about every reason this was a terrible idea. They were numerous and specific, and she was good at identifying them. Then she thought about the enforcer's hand on her arm, the practiced certainty of it. The particular cruelty of a man who grabbed hold of someone because he knew there would be no consequence. She thought about 14 silver. She thought about the holding pens. She thought about the women. I have conditions, she said. Dominic nodded once, as though this was exactly what he had expected. Name them. The people of the lower quarter are not to be disrupted during the investigation. No crown soldiers in the lanes. No visible presence that would make Casvan move his records before you have what you need. Agreed. Captain Sarah keeps her distance unless I call for her. I will not have a guard following me through a district where I need people to trust me. Agreed. And if at any point I judge that this arrangement is causing more harm than it is preventing, she said, I walk away. No argument, no royal command. I simply walk away. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who objected, the quiet of someone measuring the weight of what was being asked and deciding whether they respected it. Agreed, he said. Nora picked up the cup of spiced cider and drank from it properly, and the warmth of it spread down through her chest and settled somewhere near her ribs. And she thought with the part of her mind that was still detached and observational that she had just agreed to something she could not yet fully see the shape of, with a man she had met less than 2 hours ago in a common room that smelled of pine smoke and roasted barley, in a kingdom that did not particularly care what happened to women like her. She set the cup down. Then we have an arrangement, she said. Across the table, the Alpha King of the 6 territories looked at her with those ice-blue eyes and said nothing. But something in the set of his jaw, something almost imperceptible, eased. And Nora noticed it, and told herself firmly that it did not matter. The next morning arrived gray and reluctant, the kind of dawn that never fully committed to becoming day. The sky above Veldrath's rooftops sitting low and pale, the light filtering through the fog in flat, directionless sheets that made shadows impossible and distances difficult to read. Nora was already awake when it came. She had slept poorly, which surprised her less than the specific reason for it. She was accustomed to poor sleep. The thin mattress in the room she rented above Lady Edra's herb stores was not built for comfort, and the sounds of the lower quarter at night were never entirely quiet. But last night the wakefulness had not been anxiety exactly. It had been something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a forest you have never entered, knowing the path continues but not yet able to see where. She rose before the light fully arrived, dressed in her usual linen gown, and belted it at the waist with the worn brown strap, threw her gray cloak over her shoulders, and fastened the small iron clasp at her throat, and braided her hair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone since childhood. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the wall and thought, carefully and without sentiment, about what she had agreed to. It was not as though she had choices in abundance. That was the first honest thing. The second honest thing was that the proposal, stripped of the strangeness of its origin and the unsettling quality of the man who had made it, was structurally sound. Casvan needed to be exposed. The evidence needed to come from someone inside the district. She was, in fact, precisely the kind of person who could gather it. These were simply facts. The third honest thing she did not examine for very long at all. She went downstairs and found Lady Edra already at the work table, sorting dried chamomile into small linen pouches with fingers that moved from decades of habit rather than attention, her sharp gray eyes lifting the moment Nora appeared in the doorway. Lady Edra was a small, compact woman of 60-some years, with white hair pinned severely beneath a linen cap, and the posture of someone who had decided early in life that the world responded better to people who took up their full allotted space. She was an Alpha-born widow of a merchant, which meant she had a level of social insulation that she used deliberately and without apology to protect the Omega women in her employ. Nora was the third she had taken on in 10 years, and the only one still there. "You were out past the third bell," Lady Edra said, without looking up from the chamomile. "I was." Nora hung her cloak on the peg by the door and moved to the work table. "I had an encounter in the market square. Casvan's men." The older woman's hands stilled. "The taxation notice." "Yes." Nora began sorting the remaining chamomile without being asked. "It was resolved, for now." "Resolved how?" Lady Edra's voice had taken on a particular careful quality, the tone she used when she suspected she was not going to approve of an answer and was giving herself time to prepare. Nora considered how much to say. The arrangement with Dominic required discretion. Casvan's informants were numerous, And Lady Edra, for all her protectiveness, occasionally talked when she worried, and she was about to have reason to worry. A traveling lord intervened, Nora said. He had authority enough that Casvan's men stood down. A long pause. The chamomile rustled between Lady Edra's fingers. What kind of traveling lord? She said slowly. Wanders Veldrath Market at night and intervenes in Omega taxation disputes. The curious kind, Nora said, which was both true and unhelpful, and she could feel Lady Edra's eyes on the side of her face, and chose to give the dried herbs her full professional attention. Nora. I am fine, Nora said. The debt will be settled. I will explain more when I can. She looked up then, and met the older woman's eyes directly, and something in her expression must have carried enough steadiness to be convincing, because Lady Edra held her gaze for a long 5 seconds, and then exhaled through her nose and returned to the chamomile. Be careful, she said. Whatever it is. I always am, Nora replied. It was at best partially true. She saw Captain Sarah for the first time in daylight at the well in the central lane just before mid-morning. The captain was leaning against the stone rim of the well with a clay cup of water and the expression of someone engaged in the deeply ordinary act of resting her feet, wearing a plain brown traveling cloak that rendered her entirely unremarkable in the context of the lane. She was tall, taller than most men Nora passed on the street, with dark skin and a thick black braid, and the kind of build that suggested the traveling cloak was concealing considerably more than fabric. Her eyes moved to Nora the moment she turned the corner, with a precision that had nothing ordinary about it. Nora walked to the well and drew her own water and said, without looking directly at the captain, You are less invisible than you think. I am exactly as visible as I intend to be, Sarah replied pleasantly. Which today is slightly visible. You should know I'm here without anyone else noticing that you know. Nora considered this. Functional. His Majesty said you were practical. A pause. He wasn't wrong. Nora glanced sideways at her. Is that unusual, for him to be right about people quickly? Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face briefly into something warmer than her professional stillness suggested. He is rarely wrong about people, she said. He is occasionally wrong about situations. But people, no. She set her cup on the rim of the well. He read Casvan correctly 18 months ago when the first discrepancies appeared in the ledgers. The council told him he was mistaken. He is not a man who accepts that easily. He doesn't seem like a man who accepts much easily, Nora said. He accepts more than people think, Sarah said, and something in her tone was careful in a way that Nora filed away without pressing on. He simply does not show the accepting of it. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the lane moving around them, a boy leading a mule loaded with grain sacks, 2 women with market baskets, a craftsman with ink-stained hands who was clearly a scribe's assistant and was clearly late for something, judging by the speed of his walk. There is a man named Aldrich, Nora said quietly, watching the scribe's assistant disappear around the corner. He manages the lower quarter collection on Casvan's behalf. Every 7 days he makes a round, 12 stops, always in the same order, always with 2 men behind him. On the last stop, the one at the Cooper's Yard on Tanner Lane, he carries a locked strongbox back to Casvan's estate. She paused. The strongbox is never included in the official records I have seen posted at the district hall. Sarah's stillness sharpened. How do you know the strongbox isn't recorded? Because I read the postings, Nora said simply. Every fortnight. I've been reading them for 3 years. The amounts never add up to what Aldrich collects. A brief silence. I'll need the collection days and the route, Sarah said. I'll have them for you by tomorrow evening. Sarah looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but lived somewhere productively between the two. You've been documenting this, she said. In my head, Nora said. I didn't think writing it down was safe. It wasn't, Sarah said. That was the right call. She pushed off from the well rim and straightened her cloak. Tomorrow evening, then. The baker's stall on the south lane. I'll be buying bread. You'll want the rye, Nora said. The wheat is stale by afternoon. Sarah's mouth twitched. Noted. She picked up her cup and walked away down the lane without a backward glance, unhurried, entirely unremarkable, and Nora watched her go and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Like she was not entirely alone in this. She did not expect to see Dominic until the first arranged public appearance the following day, which made it startling when she turned from the apothecary stall in the market that same afternoon and found him standing 3 feet behind her. He was dressed more plainly than the night before. A dark wool tunic beneath the leather armor, the fur mantle absent. The braids pulled back more severely so the scar on his cheekbone was immediately visible. He looked less like a king and more like a very dangerous man who happened to be shopping in a market, which she was beginning to understand might be precisely the point. You could announce yourself, she said, recovering before her expression could do anything uncontrolled. I could, he agreed. And there it was again. That fractional ease at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and not quite the absence of one. You spoke to Sarah. As arranged. She turned back to the apothecary stall and examined a bundle of dried rosemary with her full professional attention. She confirmed the collection route. She confirmed that you already knew the collection route, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. A quality she hadn't heard there before. Something attentive in a way that felt personal rather than strategic. You have been paying attention to Casvin for 3 years. I have been surviving Casvin for 3 years, she said. Paying attention is part of surviving. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing beside her the way you feel a fire from several feet away, a warmth that had direction, that came from a specific source. How long have you been in this district? He asked. It was the first question he had asked. That was about her rather than the investigation, and it landed differently because of it. She set the rosemary down and considered the question honestly. 3 years, she said, since my village was absorbed into Casvin's territory. We were a free settlement before the boundary expansion. Eden Moore, he said. She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes without apology. I know the villages that were absorbed, he said. I know what the boundary expansion cost them. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, but its older, quieter cousin. The kind of feeling that has been sitting with a person long enough to become something they carry, rather than something that breaks them. It should not have been sanctioned the way it was. Nora looked at him for a long moment, at the ice-blue steadiness of his eyes, and the scar and the iron rings in his braids catching the dull afternoon light. No, she agreed. It should not have been. The words were simple. But in the space between them, something shifted. Something small and structural, like a stone finding its proper place in a wall, quiet and unremarkable and weight-bearing. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Dominic looked toward the far end of the market, and his expression moved back into its customary stillness, and he said, Walk back through the square with me. Casvin's informants should have their report. Nora picked up the rosemary, paid the apothecary vendor 2 copper coins, and tucked the bundle into her satchel. Then she fell into step beside the Alpha King of the 6 territories, through the gray afternoon light of Veldrath's market square, her gray cloak brushing his dark sleeve, and she told herself with great firmness that the warmth she felt had everything to do with being out of the cold wind. The fortnight passed the way difficult things often do, faster than expected and slower than desired, each day carrying its own specific weight. Nora settled into the rhythm of it with the same quiet discipline she brought to everything. Mornings with Lady Edra sorting herbs and preparing remedies. Afternoons moving through the district on the healer's errands that had always been her cover and were now also something more deliberate. She listened at market stalls and courtyard gates, and the benches outside the district hall where men gathered to complain about the weather, and if she waited long enough and said little enough, about considerably more important things than the weather. She delivered her information to Sarah in careful pieces. The name of the secondary ledger keeper Aldrich used, a man called Petrie who worked from a room above the tanner's yard. The schedule of transfers between Casvin's estate and the regional treasury house, which never matched the official posted times. The names of 2 council members who received their share not in coin, but in trade licenses that mysteriously bypassed the Crown's approval process. She delivered these things over rye bread and clay cups of watered wine at the baker's stall, in voices that barely rose above the sound of the street, and Sarah received them with the focused economy of someone who knew exactly what to do with each piece the moment it arrived. "This is enough," Sarah told her on the 9th day, tucking the last of Nora's written notes, transcribed carefully the night before by candlelight onto a scrap of parchment in the small, precise hand that Lady Edra had taught her, into the inside of her cloak. "This is more than enough. We have a full case." "Then when will it move?" Nora asked. "When the king is ready." Sarah's eyes moved briefly toward the far end of the lane and back. "He is waiting for one more thing." Nora had not asked what the one more thing was, because she had learned over 9 days that Sarah answered the questions she chose to answer, and deflected the rest with a pleasantness that was entirely impenetrable, and pushing was a waste of effort she could spend more productively elsewhere. What she had not anticipated was that the one more thing would come to her. It happened on the 11th day, in the late afternoon, when the light had gone the particular amber color that it went in autumn, just before it failed entirely, and the air carried the first serious suggestion of frost. She was returning from the lower quarter with an empty satchel, and the particular bone-deep tiredness that came from a full day of careful listening, cutting through the narrow lane behind the mill to save time, when she heard the voice. "You've been seen with him 3 times. She stopped. Lord Casvin stepped out of the shadow of the mill doorway, with the careful movement of a man who had positioned himself there long enough in advance that the positioning itself was a message. He was shorter than she had always imagined from his reputation, broad through the shoulders, with a florid face and pale eyes that were the color of winter ice, but without any of the depth that color implied in Dominic's. He wore deep green wool trimmed with fox fur, and 2 of his iron-booted enforcers materialized from the far end of the lane with the timing of something rehearsed. Nora did not run. She stood where she was and kept her breathing even, and looked at him with the careful neutrality she had spent 3 years perfecting. "My Lord Casvin," she said. 3 times, he repeated, moving closer with the deliberate pace of a man who owned the ground he walked on and intended her to feel it. The square, the market, and outside the gray stag at dusk 4 days past. My men are thorough. He stopped a few feet from her. "Who is he?" "A traveler," she said. "Passing through. Travelers don't make bond claims in public squares." His pale eyes moved over her face with an assessment that made her skin want to withdraw from itself. "They don't walk openly through my district market as though they belong there. They don't." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Something colder settling beneath the florid surface. "They don't make me feel uninformed in my own territory." "I'm sorry to hear you feel uninformed, my lord," she said, because it was the safest possible response. "You will tell me his name," Casvin said, "and his house and his purpose in Veldrath, and you will tell me now, or the 14 silver on your account will become 24 by morning, and the extension will be permanently revoked." The enforcers behind him had moved closer. She could hear their boots on the cold ground. The amber light was draining from the lane, and the frost in the air had teeth again, and she thought very briefly and very clearly about the distance to the far end of the lane, 40 feet, perhaps 50, and knew with equal clarity that she would not make it. She was constructing her answer with the careful architecture of a woman who had been constructing safe answers under pressure for 3 years, when a shadow fell across the lane entrance in front of her. She knew, before she looked, what it was. Dominic walked into the lane with the unhurried certainty of a man arriving somewhere he has every right to be. He wore his dark leather armor and the fur mantle across his shoulders, the braids loose tonight, and the 2 figures in black behind him might as well have been part of the architecture of the lane itself, for all the noise they made. He looked at Casvin. Casvin looked at him. And in the 4 seconds of silence that followed, Nora watched the regional governor of Veldrath district experience something she had never seen on his face before in 3 years of observing him from a careful distance. Uncertainty. "Lord Casvin," Dominic said. His voice was entirely pleasant. It was the most frightening version of his voice she had encountered yet. "I am glad to meet you in person. I have been meaning to discuss your district's administration." A brief pause. At length. Casvin's recovery was fast. She would give him that. The uncertainty passed across his face like a cloud shadow, and was gone, replaced by the smooth social machinery of a man who had survived a long time by reading power correctly and responding to it correctly. "My lord," he said, and the title was a question and a concession simultaneously. "I was not informed of a formal visit." "It is not formal," Dominic said pleasantly. "Not yet." His eyes moved from Casvin to Nora, and the quality of that look, steady, deliberate, was different from any look he had given her in their public appearances. This one carried something warmer underneath, something that would read, to anyone watching, as entirely genuine. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find that her voice came out the same way. Casvin's pale eyes moved between them with the sharpness of a man recalculating rapidly. "The bond claim," he said slowly. "It is genuine." "Did you doubt it?" Dominic said. And the pleasantness in his voice had an edge now, fine as a blade. A silence. The frost in the air had deepened to something that had nothing to do with weather. "Of course not," Casvin said carefully. "I simply like to know the men of standing who move through my territory, for their comfort and safety. Naturally." Dominic moved to stand beside Nora, and his arm brushed hers, and she felt the warmth of it through her cloak and his sleeve. "I will call on you at your estate tomorrow morning, my lord. There are several matters I wish to review with you in person. Your taxation ledgers among them." The change in Casvin's face was small and devastating. A tightening around the pale eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening in the shoulders beneath the fox-trimmed wool. "Of course," he said. "My estate is at your disposal." "Good." Dominic smiled, and it was the most dangerous smile Nora had ever seen because it was entirely genuine. "Until tomorrow, then." Casvin took his leave with the controlled precision of a man maintaining composure through sheer force of practice, his enforcers falling in behind him, their boots fading down the far end of the lane until the sound of them was gone. The lane was silent. Nora let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for considerably longer than she had realized, and the release of it left her feeling temporarily hollow. "He's going to move the records tonight," she said. "I know," Dominic said. "Sarah's people are already at the estate." She looked at him. "You planned for him to find me." He did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "I needed him to come to us before tomorrow," he said, "because tomorrow he would have had time to prepare. Tonight he doesn't." The logic was clean. She recognized it and resented it, and recognized the resentment as slightly irrational, given that she was standing in a cold lane unharmed instead of being escorted to a debtor's pen. "You could have told me," she said. "You would have worried." "I would have prepared," she said. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. A genuine shift, not the controlled adjustments she had catalogued over the past 11 days. Something less managed. "You're right," he said simply. "I should have told you. I'm sorry." Nora stared at him. In 3 years in Veldrath District, in a lifetime of navigating the particular architecture of power that governed every interaction between an Alpha and an Omega woman, she could count on one hand the number of times someone with authority over her situation had said those 2 words and meant them. She looked away, back down the empty lane, and pressed her cold fingers together inside her cloak. "Is it enough?" she asked. "What Sarah has, combined with what he does tonight, will it be enough?" "Yes," he said. 1 word. But he said it the way he said everything important, without decoration, without qualification. And she believed it the same way she had believed the word agreed across the table at the Grey Stag, because she had learned over 11 days that Dominic did not say things he did not mean. The frost deepened around them in the failing light. Somewhere in the district, in an estate with fox-trimmed wool and pale eyes, and 4 years of falsified ledgers, A man was beginning to panic. And Nora stood in the narrow lane behind the mill and felt the specific warmth of someone standing beside her in the cold, and did not move away from it, and this time did not tell herself a single thing about why.